Hello, this is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, welcoming you back to Economics 101. And joining me today is G. Edward Griffin, who has been writing, researching, analyzing, and presenting on economic matters for over 4 decades. Mr. Griffin, it's an honor to have you on the program today. Thank you for joining me.
Well, my pleasure, James.
Well, Mr. Griffin, you were speaking out against the Federal Reserve System decades ago, before many of its current detractors were even born. And you wrote the definitive book on the subject, The Creature from Jekyll Island, way back in the 1990s. And before it was even fashionable to talk about the Federal Reserve System, this subject obviously has seen a paradigm shift since you began speaking on it, and there are millions, tens of millions more people out there now that know about this system than did before. So for the benefit of those listeners out there who may have heard of the Federal Reserve System and know something about it, but don't really know why they should be interested in it, what can you say about why people should care about the Federal Reserve and its operations?
Well, that's a very germane question. The answer is cuttingly sharp. I mean, the reason we should care about the Federal Reserve System is because it is a fraud, and because it is a fraud that actually affects us in a very personal way. And the way it affects us is it expands the money supply, and by so doing causes this thing called inflation. And inflation is the silent thief of our purchasing power, and so it becomes like a hidden tax. So the reason people should be concerned about the Federal Reserve System is because the system is taxing them every day through this process of inflation, and most of them have no idea that it's even going on. And when you look at how much this tax is, it's the biggest tax of all. It's a silent tax. It happens daily. You can't escape it. There are no deductions, no exemptions. All you know is that the price of bread and milk and housing and education and medical care and all that stuff just keeps going up, up, and up. And even though you're getting what appears to be a nice little raise now and then from your employer, the net effect is that the standard of living of the average American is going down and has been going down for the past 3 or 4 decades. So it's a very important topic, and that's the reason I think many people are becoming interested now, is because this light is beginning to seep through the cracks, and they're figuring out that they're being robbed, and they want to know who's doing it and how they're doing it.
Absolutely. And we have seen that sea change in public opinion come about because of the tireless efforts of people like yourself. And of course now we have Ron Paul's H.R. 1207, which has 296 co-sponsors now. Tell us your thoughts about this legislation that Ron Paul has introduced, and what do you hope that it will achieve?
Well, I'm in favor of the legislation because it's instrumental in raising the consciousness of the average American. They hear about a bill to audit the Fed, and it sort of plants a question mark in their mind. Well, yeah, isn't the Fed being audited? Why not? Why do we have to have a bill to audit the Fed? Everybody else gets audited. Why do we need an act of Congress to audit the Fed? So I think it's good in the sense that it's raising the consciousness of the people and putting the Fed in the framework of something that needs to be examined and watched, whereas previously people hadn't even given much thought to the Fed at all. But beyond that, I don't think we need to audit the Fed. We need to abolish the Fed. It's like saying we need to audit the mafia. No, we know what the Fed is doing. We know that it's stealing money from us. We know that it's unethical. We know it's based on a monetary fraud. We know all of those things without having to do an audit. And I said in my book that I feared that a movement to audit the Fed would merely gain a lot of traction on the part of politicians who could grandstand and say, oh, well, look, I'm calling for an audit of the Fed, knowing full well that nothing will come of the audit, that the Fed will still continue you, and then it'll take years and years for the audit to be performed, and then they'll find out it was a whitewash, just like the Warren Commission and the 9/11 Commission were whitewashes of the event. And I saw it as a delaying tactic, and I felt we should just get on with the main task, which is to abolish the Fed. So I can see pros and cons to it, and as I said earlier, I do support the motion to audit the Fed, primarily because it's a kind of like a wake-up call to many people that once they start looking at the real facts, then they'll change their mind and say, let's abolish that thing.
Well, then, once that is accomplished and we do end up abolishing the Federal Reserve System, what system do you envisage will be set up to take its place?
Well, we have to realize what the Fed is. The Fed is not a government agency, even though it parades as such, and although it has government power, it was given that by the Federal Reserve Act, and whatever it does, we must comply with or we go to prison, which makes it look like it's a government agency. But in fact, James, it's a cartel. It's no different than a sugar cartel or an oil cartel or banana cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. It's really privately owned. It drafts its own regulations. It suckered Congress into passing a law to convert its cartel agreement into law. So now the nation has to abide by a cartel agreement. And so you say, well, what do we do without it? We do very well without anything to replace a cartel. I think the world can get along just fine without cartels. In other words, I'm saying that I think banking should be treated no differently than any other business. It should be required and regulated to be honest, to keep its contracts, and do all of the things that we expect any business to do. But beyond that, it should not be given any special privileges. It should not be given the power to create money out of nothing. It should not be given the power to throw people into jail, all of these things. So I say we don't need to replace the Fed with anything except honest banking.
Well, of course, the Federal Reserve System, at one level, is just the linchpin of a larger ideological battle taking place between individualism and collectivism. And that's something that you've gone into in great length and great detail in your public lectures and in your writings. But in the 2 minutes that we have left, tell people briefly about Freedom Force International and how people can join that organization.
Well, yes, 2 minutes won't give us much chance, but at least it'll give it honorable mention. I think people need to start thinking in terms of solutions. As we've come to the point now where we really don't need to know too much more about what's going on. Plenty of us know what the problem is, and we don't need another book. We don't need to just complain about it. We don't need to send a letter to our congressman, because generally he's the guy that got us into the mess in the first place. He's totally corrupt in many cases. What we need to do is recapture control of the system. We need to replace those congressmen and those senators and those political figures with individuals who have no axe to grind except the preservation of the constitutional liberties that we inherited. Freedom Force International is dedicated to doing that. It's dedicated to bringing about change and to recapturing control of the political system in which we live.
Well, G. Edward Griffin, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Tell people briefly about your websites and how they can find out more information about your work.
Well, Freedom Force International is where all of the real thinking goes on and where the challenges are, and that's freedomforceinternational.org, O-R-G for organization. So freedomforceinternational.org. Our commercial site where we sell books and recordings is called The Reality Zone. It's real easy to remember, realityzone.com, and there you'll find over 100 items that will reinforce this ideological battle. We have to have facts to back us up, and that's where you'll find them, at realityzone.com.
Well, G. Edward Griffin, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you.